Son, and of the Holy Spirit, brothers and sisters. Today we come to the second Sunday of the Great and Holy Fast, and of course then the Sunday of St. Gregory Palamas. And we look forward to this Sunday every year when we can reflect on the life of St. Gregory. He is someone very dear to us. To some extent, Palamas has become something of a rallying figure in the triumph of Orthodoxy, which we celebrated last Sunday, in the triumph of Orthodoxy over the West, the Western world, Western society, Western conventions, and very often Palamas is described in this way as being something of an anti-Western figure, a polemic figure who fought for the sake of the faith against Western heresies. But it's a little more complicated than that. It's not as simple as just East versus West, or good versus evil. It's the history of the dispute that St. Gregory Palamas was involved in was, first of all, a dispute that was occurring in the city of Constantinople itself. It wasn't really a dispute that was happening, between Rome and Constantinople. What had happened was that there were many scholars in Constantinople, and it was a time in the 14th century of great intellectual curiosity and interest amongst educated people, and many of the ideas that were popular in the West had found their way to Constantinople. And so there were really two different parties, or two different groups who had different theological perspectives, who were both Orthodox and both Greek, living in Constantinople, and very, very much involved in the politics of the city and of the empire. And it was in this environment that ideas were percolating. It was a very rich mixture of thinking that was going on, and it was in this environment that Gregory Palamas really had a kind of very important clarification that he gave, which was rooted not in an extremely intellectual experience, but a very practical experience. Gregory Palamas had been a monk for many years. He had gone to Manathos. He had lived in very primitive circumstances, very poor circumstances, and had devoted himself to very much to the question of prayer, to the subject of prayer, spending a lot of time in prayer. And so his perspective was not just sort of a scholarly one. It was not just an intellectual perspective, but his perspective, what he brought to this conversation that was taking place in Constantinople, what he brought to it was a lived experience. And that is the thing that I think is probably the most important for us to think about today. The simple lived experience of actually being an Orthodox Christian and praying as an Orthodox Christian. And so for Gregory Palamas, the most important thing was the connection between prayer and the thinking and the official theology of the church. And he saw where, in some of the people who he was involved in the conflict with, the disputation with, he saw that their thinking had somehow gotten, where these two things, prayer and reflection, had been severed. And that the reflection that they were engaging in, the intellectual discussion that they were having about God, had somehow detached itself from prayer and had become a purely intellectual project, as it were, by itself. And that was really the thing that disturbed him. St. Gregory is very famous for what we call the distinction between God's essence and his energies. And every year at this time, we kind of trot out this essence energies distinction, and we say this is so great that Gregory Palamas came up with this. But he didn't really come up with it on his own. He was commenting on the thinking and the teaching of St. Maximus the Confessor and of St. Dionysius the Areopagite. And so he was really pulling together the thinking of the Orthodox Church, and especially these particular fathers, which had come before him. And he was only repeating what had previously been said. But somehow, because he was in the midst of this conflict with these other people who were thinking more in line with Western theological conventions, that he became like the poster boy, the poster child. He became a figure around which we could say that here is the Orthodox perspective. But it was in the midst of a conflict that was happening within the very heart, in the very center of Orthodoxy itself, Constantinople, between the emperor and the patriarch. Everyone there was involved. Everyone had an opinion. And there was the development of a rationalism in some amongst certain people who Gregory was in opposition to. Varlam, for example, and Gregory Akindos. There was a development of a rationalistic way of thinking in theology that kind of described the human condition, mankind, in a very stark and bleak way. Man was cut off from God and sort of left on his own in this way of thinking. And Gregory, being true to the Orthodox tradition, was arguing against this. And he was saying, listen, our humanity is not the problem here. Our humanity is the solution, because Christ has healed our humanity by becoming incarnate, by taking on our humanity. He has perfected it and cleansed it and purified it so that it's working perfectly as it ought to. But that Gregory was reminding the Orthodox, listen, buddies, you got to think like Orthodox if you're going to be Orthodox. And our thinking is that we're not in opposition to God. Our humanity is not the problem here. Our humanity and our human nature and the creation itself is fully in sync with God. It's fully designed, and in fact, it won't be fulfilled ever if it doesn't find and reach the knowledge of God. That we can't have a human perfection and human happiness in any other way. We have to be true to ourselves. We have to be rooted in the experience of God. And so here is really Gregory's greatest contribution to remind the Orthodox that our perspective, our understanding of creation is that it is dynamically moving in the direction of God. And the things that separate us are really kind of artificial separations. That there is the created world and the uncreated world, but they are related to each other. There is the spiritual world and the material world, but they are related to each other. There is the temporal world and there is the eternal world, right? But they are also related to each other. And so it's not a question of all of these things being in opposition to each other and a kind of hopeless case that we have to confront in our isolation as fallen creatures. No, it's that because of Christ's incarnation, we are attracted to God, and we have the capacity to know Him. Now, we can't know Him in His essence because He is beyond knowledge in that way. But we can know Him to the extent that He wishes to reveal Himself to us, to the extent that He wishes to share with us Himself. And those sharings are His energies. Those are the graces that He freely chooses to share with us, and which are the natural goal of our being. So that we ought to look for those things. We ought to seek them out. When I was in high school, I read a book by a famous Catholic monk whose name is Thomas Merton. And I got very interested in the monastic life, and I wrote to some different monasteries asking them, if I could come and visit, and expressing an interest in their life. And I got back, these kind of standard brochures, like how to be a monk, what is monastic life all about, prayer, spirituality. And they were interesting brochures that they sent me. But one of them was very different. It was a very small little sheet of paper, and on it, it had some of the characteristics of a monk. And they said, we're not looking for people who are like denying life, who are escaping from things that they're not comfortable with, who are running away from the world. And then they had this one comment. They said, we like it if you can smell the soup. We like it if you can smell the soup. And to me, that really hit the nail on the head. It was like a thunderbolt almost, like that it opened up a new perspective. What was that perspective that was being opened up when I read this? They like it, we like it if you can smell the soup. In other words, the candidates that they were going to consider for becoming a monk in this particular place were people who were awake and aware, who had a normal sort of interest in things. They weren't. They were able to notice things for what they really are. To be someone who can smell the soup, who can appreciate a small thing, a simple thing, is important. And it's not a question of running off like to the library and reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of very dense, arcane, complex, thinking with many languages and complicated concepts. In many ways, to be a good Christian in the mold of St. Gregory Palamas is to be the person who can smell the soup, who can unite in their own body, in their own flesh. They can unite matter and spirit, the uncreated and the created, the temporal and the eternal. there's a capacity in us which we spend most of our lives denying. But there is a capacity in us for God. And the sooner that we admit that, and the sooner that we begin to respond to that capacity and invite God to dwell within us, and then begin to relate to Him in that way, because we know that He is the ultimate force in our lives, and He is the true goal of our lives, and the sort of the energy that we need to live, to truly live. That's when we can smell the soup. That's when we can go and pick a simple flower and smell it and see in the simplicity of that thing a reflection of God's glory. And we can be content and fully grateful for the infinitely small things that we have, that have come to us, that we can appreciate time in a different way. Instead of looking at life as a transaction to get through, to process, to monetize, if we could look at life as an absolute miraculous gift that should just shock us. You know, that's what being able to smell the soup means. That we realize the shocking capacity of God's love in and through the creation. How He has blessed us to be living as part of this creation, and to mirror His glory is such an incredible vocation, which we spend so much time denying, as if we didn't have that vocation. But if we would affirm and recognize that vocation and live according to it, then we would be living in a Palamite way, in a Palamite time, and in a Palamite awareness. And that is the gift of St. Gregory Palamas to us. And that is the gift of the Church to us on this second Sunday of the Great and Holy Fast, when we are supposed to be taking time to step back from all of the nonsense that we allow to distract us all year long, and to just be quiet and think for a little bit about what we have, what gifts we have, how blessed we are, and what are we going to do about it. Amen.